The task ahead for Hercule Poirot felt strikingly similar to a political minefield, cleaning up a mess of corruption and scandal, though in the world of politics, nothing is ever simple. Sir George Conway's words fell from his lips, heavy with the weight of national responsibility. "The situation is an extremely delicate one, Monsieur Poirot," he said, his voice tinged with urgency. Poirot couldn't help but suppress a slight smile, but instead of speaking his mind, he leaned back and put on the expression of a man prepared for the long haul, a model of politeness and restraint, like a doctor readying himself for a particularly complicated diagnosis. The pompous rhetoric continued, with Conway speaking in abstract terms about the delicacy of the government's position, the interests of the public, and the power of the press. It all sounded so polished, yet so devoid of meaning. Poirot's patience wore thin, and he could feel the all-too-familiar tug of a yawn threatening to escape. He had endured similar speeches before, particularly in the halls of Parliament, where the sound of words often served more to obscure than to enlighten. But it wasn't long before another voice, sharp and direct, cut through the monotony. Edward Ferrier, the Prime Minister, cleared his throat and decided it was time to reveal the truth. "All right, George, I'll take it from here," Ferrier said with quiet authority, his calm demeanor masking the gravity of the situation. Poirot turned his gaze toward Ferrier, feeling an immediate sense of intrigue. He had heard whispers about Ferrier from Professor MacLeod, a man Poirot trusted implicitly, and the words "sound man" rang in his ears like a high compliment. In the world of politics, sound was as rare a quality as it was vital. The Prime Minister spoke again, this time with an air of discomfort. "Monsieur Poirot, are you familiar with a publication called the X-Ray News?" he asked. Poirot, caught off guard, admitted, "I have glanced at it." Ferrier's lips tightened as he continued, his voice dropping lower. "Then you are aware of what it's about. Sensational gossip, half-truths, and hints at scandal. Some harmless, some outright dangerous, but all served with a side of spice." Poirot nodded slowly, fully aware of the nature of such publications. He had seen this type of sensationalism before. Ferrier paused, his voice shifting, growing colder and more serious. "But in the past 2 weeks, something has changed," he said. "There have been whispers about impending disclosures, revelations of corruption at the highest levels of government. And this time, Poirot, it's not just a common trick. These revelations will not disappoint." There was a dangerous edge to Ferrier's words, one that sent a ripple of tension through the room. The task ahead for Hercule Poirot felt strikingly similar to a political minefield, cleaning up a mess of corruption and scandal, though in the world of politics, nothing is ever simple. Sir George Conway's words fell from his lips, heavy with the weight of national responsibility. "The situation is an extremely delicate one, Monsieur Poirot," he said, his voice tinged with urgency. Poirot couldn't help but suppress a slight smile, but instead of speaking his mind, he leaned back and put on the expression of a man prepared for the long haul, a model of politeness and restraint, like a doctor readying himself for a particularly complicated diagnosis. The pompous rhetoric continued, with Conway speaking in abstract terms about the delicacy of the government's position, the interests of the public, and the power of the press. It all sounded so polished, yet so devoid of meaning. Poirot's patience wore thin, and he could feel the all-too-familiar tug of a yawn threatening to escape. He had endured similar speeches before, particularly in the halls of Parliament, where the sound of words often served more to obscure than to enlighten. But it wasn't long before another voice, sharp and direct, cut through the monotony. Edward Ferrier, the Prime Minister, cleared his throat and decided it was time to reveal the truth. "All right, George, I'll take it from here," Ferrier said with quiet authority, his calm demeanor masking the gravity of the situation. Poirot turned his gaze toward Ferrier, feeling an immediate sense of intrigue. He had heard whispers about Ferrier from Professor MacLeod, a man Poirot trusted implicitly, and the words "sound man" rang in his ears like a high compliment. In the world of politics, sound was as rare a quality as it was vital. The Prime Minister spoke again, this time with an air of discomfort. "Monsieur Poirot, are you familiar with a publication called the X-Ray News?" he asked. Poirot, caught off guard, admitted, "I have glanced at it." Ferrier's lips tightened as he continued, his voice dropping lower. "Then you are aware of what it's about. Sensational gossip, half-truths, and hints at scandal. Some harmless, some outright dangerous, but all served with a side of spice." Poirot nodded slowly, fully aware of the nature of such publications. He had seen this type of sensationalism before. Ferrier paused, his voice shifting, growing colder and more serious. "But in the past 2 weeks, something has changed," he said. "There have been whispers about impending disclosures, revelations of corruption at the highest levels of government. And this time, Poirot, it's not just a common trick. These revelations will not disappoint." There was a dangerous edge to Ferrier's words, one that sent a ripple of tension through the room. Poirot, ever the master of discretion, studied the Prime Minister's face with keen interest. "You are sure, Monsieur Ferrier?" he asked, his voice soft, yet sharp as a razor. "Because once the press gets wind of a story like this, it's rarely the facts that come to light." Ferrier gave a tight smile, though his eyes were hard. "I assure you, Poirot," he replied, "these are not your average scandalous rumors. These will shake the very foundation of our government." Poirot felt a chill run down his spine. This wasn't just another case of sensationalist exaggeration. It was something real, something dangerous. And in that moment, Hercule Poirot knew that he would need all his wits to navigate this political web. The stakes had never been higher. Hercule Poirot leaned forward slightly, his sharp gaze fixed on Edward Ferrier, his voice calm but probing. "You know, then, what these revelations are going to be?" Ferrier hesitated for a brief moment, his brow furrowed in thought, before he spoke with calculated precision. "With a fair amount of accuracy," he said. He then began outlining the story, carefully and methodically, as if measuring each word for impact. The tale he weaved was far from edifying. It was a web of lies and deceit, accusations of the highest order, shameless chicanery, underhanded share-juggling, and a gross misuse of party funds. And at the center of it all stood the late Prime Minister, John Hammett. Ferrier's voice faltered only briefly as he described how the accusations painted Hammett not as a leader of integrity, but as a dishonorable rascal, a master of deception, a man who had used his position for his own gain, amassing a vast private fortune while betraying the very people who trusted him. Sir George Conway could hardly contain himself. He groaned, his face turning crimson. "It's monstrous, monstrous," he spluttered. "This fellow Perry, who edits the rag, ought to be shot." His anger was palpable, his fists clenched on the table. Poirot, ever the calm observer, maintained his composure. "These so-called revelations, are they to appear in the X-Ray News?" he asked, his voice even, though a flicker of concern crossed his mind. "Yes," Ferrier confirmed, his tone heavy with resignation. Poirot's eyes narrowed slightly, sensing the gravity of the situation. "What steps do you propose to take about them?" he asked, leaning back in his chair, waiting for Ferrier's response. Ferrier hesitated, then answered slowly, as if weighing his words carefully. "They constitute a private attack on John Hammett. It is open to him to sue the paper for libel." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "Will he do that?" "No," Ferrier replied, his voice grim. "It's probable that there's nothing the X-ray news would like better than for him to do so. The publicity would be enormous. Their defense would be that the statements are fair comment, and they would claim that everything printed is true. The entire sordid affair would be laid bare, exposed to the world under the harsh light of scrutiny." "Still," Poirot pressed, "if the case went against them, the damages could be catastrophic." Ferrier's expression darkened. "It might not go against them," he said, his voice low. "Why?" Poirot asked, his curiosity piqued. Sir George, too, was eager to interject, but Ferrier, already on edge, cut him off. "Because," Ferrier said, his words carrying the weight of inevitability, "what they intend to print is the truth." The room seemed to fall into a stunned silence. A deep, audible groan came from Sir George Conway, who was clearly shaken by the harsh truth laid before him. "Edward, my dear fellow, we don't admit, surely—" His voice trailed off in disbelief. A faint, almost ironic smile flickered across Ferrier's tired face. "Unfortunately, George, sometimes the stark truth has to be told. And this is one of those times." Sir George, now visibly distressed, leaned forward, his face flushed with indignation. "You understand, Monsieur Poirot, all this is strictly in confidence. Not a word, not one word, of this can be spoken to anyone outside this room." Ferrier's gaze was unflinching. "Monsieur Poirot understands that," he said, his voice resolute. But then his tone shifted, becoming even more somber. "What he may not understand, though, is this. The entire future of the People's Party is at stake. John Hammett was the very symbol of the party. He was what we stood for, a man who embodied decency, honesty, and the ideals of the people. No one ever claimed we were brilliant. We muddled through, but we always stood for doing our best, and we stood above all for fundamental honesty." Poirot's sharp eyes never left Ferrier as he continued, his voice filled with both regret and determination. "And now, this is our disaster. The man who was our figurehead, the one we trusted above all else as the honest man of the people, turns out to have been one of the worst crooks of this generation." Another groan escaped Sir George, who was clearly in turmoil. Poirot, never one to show emotion, remained calm as ever. "You knew nothing of all this?" he asked, his tone gentle but penetrating. For a brief moment Ferrier's weary eyes seemed to soften, and a ghost of a smile flickered across his face. "You may not believe me, Monsieur Poirot," he said quietly, "but like everyone else, I was completely deceived. I never understood my wife's peculiar attitude of reserve toward her father. But now I do. She knew him in a way I never could." The weight of Ferrier's words hung heavy in the air. The truth, once buried beneath layers of political rhetoric and public adoration, had been revealed at last. And with it came the realization that no matter how carefully they had constructed their world of appearances, sometimes the darkest truths would surface in the most unexpected ways. Edward Ferrier paused, his hands clasped tightly before him, his eyes haunted by the enormity of the situation. "When the truth began to leak out," he said at last, his voice shaking with the weight of what was to come, "I was horrified, incredulous. We were blindsided. We had no choice but to demand my father-in-law's resignation on the grounds of ill health." He exhaled sharply, as though trying to push away the memory. "And then we set to work, trying to clean up this mess, if you can even call it that." Sir George Conway groaned in disbelief. "The Augean Stables. What a mess, what a disaster." Ferrier's expression grew even grimmer as he nodded, his tone now heavy with the dread of what lay ahead. "It will prove, I fear, to be too Herculean a task for us, George. Once the facts become public, once they flood the streets and airwaves, there will be a tidal wave of reaction, sweeping across the country. The government will fall like a house of cards, and when that happens, there will be a general election, and in all probability Everhard and his party will be returned to power. You know Everhard's policies." Sir George spluttered in disgust, his face twisting with disdain. "A firebrand, a complete firebrand. The man is reckless, a danger to the nation." Ferrier did not flinch, though his voice grew more measured, almost sorrowful. "Everhard may be reckless, but he has undeniable ability. Unfortunately, that ability is tempered with belligerence and utter tactlessness. His supporters—" He paused, shaking his head with a rueful smile. "They are inept, disorganized, and constantly wavering. It would be nothing short of a dictatorship." Poirot, who had been silently listening, nodded thoughtfully. "A situation that could unravel swiftly," he said, his voice calm, yet every word precise. Sir George, unable to contain himself, mumbled, "If only we could hush it all up, just silence the noise, bury the truth." Ferrier's face, already lined with exhaustion, showed the unmistakable signs of defeat. Slowly, he shook his head. "It can't be hushed up," he murmured. "Too many people know. It's out there, spreading like wildfire. It's too big to suppress." Poirot looked at him, his sharp gaze narrowing. "So, you believe that all hope is lost?" "I called upon you, Monsieur Poirot," Ferrier replied, his voice low but full of conviction, "because I knew you might be the only one who could see beyond the conventional, the only one who could offer a solution where all others fail." He paused, his voice growing heavier with the weight of his confession. "The only options left are extreme, force or bribery. But neither can succeed. We need something drastic." The Home Secretary, in his frustration, compared our troubles to the task of cleaning the Augean Stables. "The truth, Monsieur Poirot, is that it will require the power of a raging river, a flood of disruption, and something so extraordinary that only a miracle can save us." Poirot's face remained impassive, but a small, knowing smile tugged at the corner of his lips. "A miracle, you say?" he asked, his voice laced with irony. "It needs, in fact, a Hercules," he added, leaning forward slightly, a glimmer of amusement in his eyes. "And, monsieur, you must remember, my name is Hercule." Ferrier, taken aback for just a moment, let out a short, dry laugh. "Can you perform miracles, Monsieur Poirot?" he asked, his voice filled with a mix of hope and skepticism. Poirot's gaze remained steady, his expression almost serene. "Is that not why you sent for me? Because you thought that perhaps, just perhaps, I might be the one to find a way?" Ferrier considered this for a long moment, his gaze softening. "It's true," he admitted slowly. "I realize that if any salvation is to be achieved, it can only come through something fantastic, something completely unorthodox, a solution no one else would dare even entertain." He hesitated, as though wrestling with the enormity of the choice before him. "But perhaps, Monsieur Poirot, you see this situation through an ethical lens? John Hammett was a crook. The legend of John Hammett must be shattered. The question remains, can one truly build an honest house on dishonest foundations? I don't know, but I want to try." He gave a bitter, almost sardonic smile. "The politician, it seems, always wants to remain in office, but, as ever, it's for the highest of motives." Hercule Poirot rose from his seat, his figure exuding calm confidence as he faced Ferrier. "Monsieur," he said slowly, My time in the police force has not, I admit, left me with a very high opinion of politicians. If John Hammett were still in power, I would not lift a finger. No, not even the smallest one." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle. "But," he continued, his voice tinged with a note of respect, "I know something about you. I have been told, by a man whose brilliance is unmatched, that you are a sound man. I will do what I can." With that, he gave a respectful bow and turned to leave the room. Sir George, still fuming with indignation, could barely contain himself. "Well, of all the damned cheek," he muttered, but Ferrier, ever the diplomat, smiled faintly and nodded. "It was a compliment," he said softly, almost to himself. As Poirot descended the stairs, a tall, fair-haired woman intercepted him. Her presence was commanding, her poise unmistakable. "Please, Monsieur Poirot," she said quietly, her voice a perfect balance of warmth and urgency. "Come into my sitting room." Poirot, intrigued, followed her into the room. She closed the door with a soft click and gestured to an armchair. "Please," she said, offering him a cigarette before settling down opposite him. Her eyes met his with a directness that left no room for evasion. "You have just seen my husband," she began, her voice quiet but strong, "and he has told you about my father." Poirot regarded her carefully. He saw before him a tall, graceful woman, still possessing a striking beauty, with a face that radiated intelligence and resolve. Mrs. Ferrier was a figure of strength, someone who commanded respect. As the wife of the Prime Minister, she was a figure in the limelight, but even more so as the daughter of John Hammett. Dagmar Ferrier was the embodiment of the ideal Englishwoman. A devoted wife, a doting mother, someone who embraced the country life with grace. She was deeply involved in charities, leading initiatives for the wives of unemployed men, and becoming a respected figure throughout the nation. As the wife of the Prime Minister, she'd been a valuable asset to the party. But now, as the daughter of a man whose deceit was about to become public knowledge, her world would be irrevocably altered. Hercule Poirot observed Mrs. Ferrier closely, his expression softening with sympathy. "You must be terribly worried, madame," he said gently, his voice a quiet murmur of understanding. She looked at him, the weight of her worries pressing down on her as though 1,000 unseen hands were crushing her. "Oh, I am. More than you can imagine," she replied, her voice trembling with a rawness that spoke volumes. "For years, I've been dreading something. I didn't know what, but I knew something would happen, something terrible." Her eyes lowered, as if afraid to face the truth that had finally caught up with her. Poirot's voice remained calm, though his gaze never left hers. "You had no idea of what was truly going on, madame?" he asked, probing gently but with careful precision. She shook her head, her shoulders slumping under the invisible weight of her own despair. "No, not in the least," she confessed bitterly. "I only knew that my father wasn't. Well, he wasn't what everyone thought him to be. Even as a child, I could see that he was a humbug." Her words were sharp, as though she were cutting through years of carefully maintained illusions. "But Edward, my poor Edward, he will lose everything because of me, because of who my father was." Poirot took a deep breath, his mind already calculating the hidden forces at play. "Have you any enemies, madame?" he asked, his voice steady, though a certain edge lingered in his words. She looked at him, surprised by the question, but her eyes quickly narrowed as she considered it. "Enemies," she echoed, the word foreign on her tongue. "I don't think so." She paused, then added more to herself than to Poirot. "But maybe I do." Poirot leaned forward, his gaze sharpening. "I think you do," he said, his voice lowering. its calmness belying the gravity of his words. "There is a great campaign afoot, against your husband, against you. You must prepare yourself, madame. Defend yourself." Her lips parted as though to protest, but then she stopped, realizing the truth in his words. "But it doesn't matter about me," she said desperately. "It's Edward, only Edward. If anything happens to him—" "The one includes the other," Poirot interrupted, his voice firm, yet gentle. "Remember, madame, you are Caesar's wife." The words hit her like a wave, and she visibly paled. Her hand gripped the armrest, her knuckles turning white as she leaned forward, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and confusion. "What is it you're trying to tell me, Monsieur Poirot?" she asked, her words barely above a whisper, but laden with urgency. Meanwhile, across town, Percy Perry, editor of the X-Ray News, sat in his office. A small, weasel-like man with eyes that darted around the room like a predator seeking its next meal. He sat behind a cluttered desk, a cigarette dangling from his lips as he spoke in a soft, oily voice, relishing every word. "We'll give him the dirt all right. Lovely, lovely. Oh boy, this is going to be delicious." His second in command, a lanky youth with thick spectacles, looked uneasy, his voice laced with hesitation. "You're not nervous, are you? I mean, expecting strong-arm tactics from them? Will they try something?" Perry's eyes glinted with a smug confidence as he waved off the concern. "Nervous? Not them," he sneered. "They haven't got the nerve. Besides, it wouldn't do them any good. Not the way we've got it farmed out. This story's spread out across this country, across the continent, and even America." The young man glanced around nervously. "They must be in a pretty good stew. You don't think they'll just give up, do you? They'll try something, surely." Perry smirked. "They'll send someone to talk pretty, to try and make it all go away. But we've got this locked down tight, boy. No one's stopping this now." Just then, a buzzer sounded from the intercom. Perry reached over and picked up the receiver. "Who's that?" "Right, send him up." With a sly grin, he set the receiver down and leaned back in his chair, his eyes twinkling with amusement. "Well, well, well. They've sent that high-toned Belgian detective to try and do his thing. He wants to know if we'll play ball with him." He chuckled to himself as the sound of footsteps approached. Moments later, Hercule Poirot entered the room, his impeccable suit and white camellia in his lapel a sharp contrast to the disarray surrounding him. He walked with the quiet confidence of a man who knew exactly where he stood and who he was dealing with. "Ah, Monsieur Poirot," Perry said, his voice dripping with insincerity. "Pleased to meet you. On your way to the royal enclosure at Ascot?" "No? My mistake." His eyes flicked over Poirot's attire, an attempt to belittle, but Poirot's calm smile was unbothered. "I am flattered," Poirot replied, his voice smooth. "One hopes to present a good appearance, as it is even more important," he added, casting a seemingly innocent glance at Perry's disheveled office and attire, when one has few natural advantages. Perry's face darkened slightly, irritation flashing in his eyes. "What do you want to see me about?" he asked curtly, trying to steer the conversation to business. Poirot leaned forward, his demeanor calm but his words sharp. He tapped Perry's knee with a finger, his smile widening. "Blackmail," he said, his voice brimming with amusement. Perry's face froze, his earlier swagger faltering for just a second. "What the devil do you mean, blackmail?" he spat, clearly caught off guard. Poirot leaned back in his chair, his gaze never leaving Perry's face. "I have heard," he said, his tone casual. "The little bird has told me that on several occasions you've been on the verge of publishing certain very damaging statements in your little spiritual paper. Until, of course, a pleasant increase in your bank balance arrives and Suddenly, those statements never see the light of day. He sat back, nodding slowly as if the matter were already settled in his mind. Perry's face flushed a shade of red as he stammered. "Do you realize that what you're suggesting amounts to slander?" Poirot's smile remained, unfazed. "I am sure you will not take offense," he said, his voice laced with dry amusement. Perry's temper snapped. "I do take offense, and as for blackmail, there's no evidence of my ever having blackmailed anyone." Poirot raised a hand in a placating gesture. No, I am quite sure of that. You misunderstand me, Monsieur Perry. I was not threatening you. I was merely leading up to a simple question." He leaned in closer, his voice a soft whisper. "How much?" Perry blinked, clearly bewildered. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, trying to regain his composure. Poirot's eyes twinkled. "A matter of national importance, Monsieur Perry," he said with quiet significance, his gaze never leaving the editor's. The two men exchanged a long, charged glance, and Perry's face tightened. He cleared his throat before speaking again. "I'm a reformer, Monsieur Poirot," he said, his voice gaining some measure of his previous bravado. "I want to see politics cleaned up. I'm opposed to corruption." He paused, his gaze hardening. "Do you know what the state of politics is in this country? It's like the Augean Stables, no more, no less." "Tiens," Hercule Poirot exclaimed with surprise. "You, too, use that phrase." His eyes glinted with a knowing amusement as he looked at Percy Perry, who was busily waxing eloquent about the state of the world. "Indeed, it is the only solution," Perry continued, leaning forward with dramatic flair. "What's needed to cleanse these Augean Stables is the great purifying flood of public opinion. That's what will wash away the rot and corruption choking this country. It's the only way forward." Poirot rose from his seat slowly, a smile tugging at his lips. "I applaud your sentiments, Monsieur Perry," he said in a tone that could have been mistaken for sincere admiration. "It is a pity, however, that you do not feel in need of money." His words lingered in the air, sharp and pointed. Perry's face flushed, his eyes darting nervously as he fumbled for an explanation. "Wait a sec. Now, I didn't exactly say that." But Poirot was already making his way toward the door, his steps deliberate and unhurried. "A most interesting conversation, Monsieur Perry. But alas, I must be off." In the busy offices of the branch, Hercule Poirot met with the ever-optimistic Everett Dashwood, a young man who always seemed to radiate an unflappable cheer. "There's dirt and dirt, my boy," Dashwood said with a wink as he clapped Poirot affectionately on the back. "But my dirt's clean dirt, that's all." Poirot chuckled, though his smile was faint. "I was not suggesting that you were on a par with Percy Perry, Monsieur Dashwood." "That damn little bloodsucker?" Dashwood sneered, his eyes narrowing with disdain. "He's a blot on our profession. If we could, we'd all take him down. He's nothing but a parasite." Poirot shook his head, his expression thoughtful. "It happens," he said quietly, "that I am engaged at the moment in a little matter of clearing up a political scandal." Dashwood leaned forward, his curiosity piqued. "Cleaning out the Augean Stables, eh?" "Too much for you, my boy. The only hope is to divert the Thames and wash away the Houses of Parliament." "You are cynical," Poirot remarked, his eyes twinkling. "I know the world, that's all." Poirot's gaze became steely. "You, I think, are just the man I seek. You have a reckless disposition, you are a good sport, and you like something that is out of the usual." Dashwood raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "And granting all that?" Poirot smiled, the corners of his lips lifting in quiet confidence. "I have a little scheme to put into action. If my ideas are correct, there is a sensational plot to unmask. That, my friend, shall be a scoop for your paper." Dashwood's eyes lit up, the promise of a juicy story too good to resist. "Can do," he said eagerly, already imagining the headlines. "What's the scoop?" "It will concern a scurrilous plot against a woman," Poirot said with a nod. "Better and better," Dashwood responded, grinning. "Sex stuff always goes." "Then sit down and listen carefully," Poirot said, as the plot began to take shape. The scene shifted to the Goose and Feathers in Little Wimplington, where gossip flowed as freely as the ale. "Well, I don't believe it," one man said, shaking his head in disbelief. "John Hammett was always an honest man. He wasn't like some of these political folk." Another voice interrupted, skeptical. "That's what they say about all swindlers before they're found out." A third voice, full of disgust, added, "Thousands, they say, he made from that Palestine oil business. Just a crooked deal it was. Whole lot of 'em tarred with the same brush. Dirty crooks, every one of 'em," someone else chimed in. "But you wouldn't find Everhard doing that," one man protested. "He's one of the old school." "Hey, but I can't believe John Hammett was a wrong 'un," another man grumbled. "You can't believe everything the papers say." And then the conversation turned to Mrs. Ferrier. Ferrier's wife was his daughter. Have you seen what they're saying about her? A well-worn copy of the X-ray News passed from hand to hand. The headline read, "Caesar's wife." A certain highly placed political lady was seen in very strange surroundings the other day, complete with her gigolo. The whispers grew louder. "Oh, Dagmar, Dagmar, how could you be so naughty?" one woman said, a hint of scandal in her voice. A man spoke up slowly, his voice low. "Mrs. Ferrier's not that kind. A gigolo. That's one of those Dago skunks, isn't it?" Another voice, filled with bitterness, said, "You never can tell with women. The whole bunch of 'em's wrong 'uns if you ask me." Meanwhile, in the Ferrier household, Edward Ferrier was beside himself with rage, his face pale with frustration. "These attacks on my wife, scurrilous, absolutely scurrilous," he thundered at Hercule Poirot. "I'm bringing an action against that vile rag. They can't just print lies like this." Poirot looked at him, his expression unreadable. "I do not advise you to do so, Monsieur Ferrier. But these damned lies have got to be stopped." Ferrier spat, pacing the room. "This is a matter of honor." Poirot's voice was calm but firm. "Are you sure they are lies?" Ferrier stopped in his tracks, his face flushing with fury. "God damn you, yes!" he snapped. Poirot's eyes softened ever so slightly as he asked, "What does your wife say?" For a brief moment Ferrier was silent, caught off guard. "She says it is best to take no notice," he muttered, his voice faltering. "But I can't do that. Everyone is talking." Poirot nodded slowly. "Yes, everyone is talking." And then, in a swift move, the news hit the papers. A small but ominous announcement appeared in every newspaper. "Mrs. Ferrier has had a slight nervous breakdown. She has gone to Scotland to recuperate." But the rumors didn't stop there. Whispers spread like wildfire, each more scandalous than the last. People began to say Mrs. Ferrier wasn't in Scotland at all. In fact, she had been seen in Paris, with a dark, handsome Argentine gigolo named Ramon, drugged or drunk, her behavior a far cry from the dignified woman everyone had once known. The X-ray News dug deep, publishing scandalous photos of Mrs. Ferrier in nightclubs, draped around the shoulder of a vicious-looking young man. Another snapshot showed her lounging on a beach, her arm casually resting over the shoulder of another man. The headline, "Mrs. Ferrier has a good time." 2 days later, a libel suit was filed against the X-ray News. The prosecution was led by Sir Mortimer Inglewood, K.C., who entered the courtroom with righteous indignation, ready to battle for justice. The stage was set. The story was far from over. The courtroom was charged with an electric atmosphere as Sir Mortimer Inglewood rose to his feet, his voice ringing with indignation. He had a solemn expression on his face as he addressed the court. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Mrs. Ferrier is the victim of a vile and malicious plot, one worthy of comparison only to the infamous Queen's Necklace affair, a scandal meant to tarnish the reputation of a noble woman, just as that plot sought to bring down Marie Antoinette herself." The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder, a ripple of intrigue running through the audience. "This conspiracy," Sir Mortimer continued, "was designed to undermine a woman of virtue, someone held in the highest regard by this country, much like Caesar's wife, above reproach." His eyes swept over the jury, daring them to doubt his words. The air was thick with anticipation as he began to call his witnesses. The first was the Bishop of Northumbria, Dr. Henderson, a man known throughout the land for his saintliness, integrity, and unyielding virtue. When he stepped into the witness box, the room seemed to hold its breath. "I swear," the bishop began in his calm, measured voice, "that between the dates in question, Mrs. Edward Ferrier was staying at the palace with my wife and myself. She had been worn out by her tireless work with charity and good deeds. Her visit was kept secret to protect her from the prying eyes of the press." The next witness, an eminent doctor, corroborated the bishop's testimony, speaking of his orders for Mrs. Ferrier to take rest and completely avoid stress. Another local physician confirmed that he had attended to her at the palace. But then came a name that caught everyone's attention: Thelma Anderson. A hush fell over the courtroom as she entered the witness stand. A woman of striking resemblance to Mrs. Ferrier, she carried herself with an air of mystery. Eyes were fixed on her as she took her place. "Your name is Thelma Anderson?" the prosecutor asked, his voice sharp. "Yes," she replied coolly. "You are Danish?" "Yes, from Copenhagen." "And you worked at a cafe in Copenhagen?" "Yes, I did," she said, her gaze steady as she recounted the events of that fateful day. "Please tell us," the prosecutor urged, "what happened on the 18th of March." Thelma took a deep breath and began. "There is a man who used to come to my table at the cafe, an English gentleman. He told me he worked for an English paper, the X-ray News." The room seemed to lean in, everyone hanging on her every word. "Are you sure it was the X-ray News?" the prosecutor pressed. "Yes, I am sure. At first, I thought it was a medical paper, but then he explained it was not." She paused before continuing. "He said there was an English actress who needed a stand-in, someone who resembled her in public appearances. He said I was the perfect type for the job." The courtroom buzzed with whispers. The mystery was deepening. "How much money did he offer you?" the prosecutor asked, his voice rising with anticipation. £500, she replied. "At first, I thought it was some trick, but then he gave me half the money up front. So I quit my job and agreed." The tension in the courtroom mounted as Thelma described her journey to Paris, the new clothes she received, and the escort provided for her. An Argentine gentleman, described as polite and respectful. "A very nice gentleman," she said, her voice softening. "He took me to many places, nightclubs in Paris, some on the Riviera." The prosecutor leaned forward. "And what kind of places were these?" Thelma hesitated for a moment, then admitted, "Some were not respectable." A murmur ran through the crowd. "But Señor Ramon was always kind to me," she added quickly. "It was all for advertisement. They told me it was necessary for the publicity." The prosecutor's eyes narrowed. And did you ever hear the name Mrs. Ferrier mentioned during your time with these men? She shook her head. Number, I didn't know who I was supposed to be standing in for. It was only later, when I saw the pictures, that I realized. With that, the prosecutor began showing the infamous photographs. Thelma in Paris, at nightclubs, and on the beach, her arm draped over the shoulder of the olive-skinned gentleman. "Do you recognize these photographs?" he asked. She nodded reluctantly. Yes, they were taken of me in Paris and the Riviera. As she spoke, the courtroom was filled with a tense silence. The photographs, the connections, and the unsettling similarities between Thelma and Mrs. Ferrier all pointed to the same conclusion. Mrs. Ferrier had been framed, the victim of a dark conspiracy. The courtroom drama intensified, with the layers of deceit unfolding, each revelation adding weight to the growing scandal. The audience, on edge, couldn't look away as Poirot's intricate web of truth and lies began to tighten around those responsible for the attack on Mrs. Ferrier's honor. The courtroom became a battleground, not just for justice, but for the soul of a nation gripped by scandal. There was no mistaking it. Thelma Anderson had all the hallmarks of absolute honesty, but the woman was clearly naive. Pleasant, yes, but not exactly sharp. It was evident to everyone that she was genuinely distressed now that the truth had come to light. As the defense team desperately tried to spin their tale, their frantic denials rang hollow. They insisted they had no dealings with the woman, but their weak excuses fell flat in the face of mounting evidence. The photographs, they argued, had simply been delivered to their London office, and they had believed them to be genuine. But it was Sir Mortimer's closing speech that truly set the courtroom alight. His words were laced with passion, rallying the crowd and evoking a collective sense of justice. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he thundered, "this entire scheme was nothing less than a vile political plot, conceived to bring down not just Mrs. Ferrier, but the Prime Minister and his entire administration. We must stand by the victim of this wicked attack, Mrs. Ferrier, a woman whose honor has been irreparably harmed. The perpetrators must be made to pay." The air in the courtroom crackled with fervor, and the jury's verdict was inevitable. The room erupted in applause when the decision was announced. A staggering sum was awarded in damages, a fitting consequence for the wickedness that had been uncovered. Mrs. Ferrier, her husband, and her father left the court to the cheers and admiration of the crowd that had gathered outside. Edward Ferrier grasped Hercule Poirot's hand warmly, his face alight with gratitude. "I can't thank you enough, Monsieur Poirot," Edward said, his voice thick with emotion. "1,000 times I thank you. That filthy rag, the X-ray news, is finished, wiped out, and it serves them right for trying to destroy Dagmar, the kindest soul in the world. Thank God you were able to expose the whole scandal for what it was, a filthy ramp, nothing more." Poirot's eyes twinkled, his expression as calm as ever. "What made you suspect they were using a double?" Edward asked, still in awe of Poirot's brilliance. "Ah, but it is not a new idea," Poirot said with a small smile. "It was used in the case of Jeanne de la Motte, when she impersonated Marie Antoinette. The technique is as old as time." Edward raised an eyebrow. "I must reread the Queen's necklace. But how did you find this woman, the one they were using?" Poirot leaned back, crossing his arms with a satisfied air. "I looked for her in Denmark, naturally. Mrs. Ferrier's grandmother was Danish, and Dagmar herself has a distinctly Danish look. But there were other reasons, too." Edward's eyes widened. "Denmark? The resemblance was remarkable, that's true. But what a devilish idea! How could anyone come up with such a scheme?" Poirot chuckled softly, tapping his chest. "It wasn't them who came up with it, Edward. It was I who thought of it. Edward stared, perplexed. "I don't understand. What do you mean?" Poirot's smile deepened. "Ah, you must go further back in history than the Queen's necklace. Think of the cleansing of the Augean Stables. Hercules used a river, a great force of nature. Now, modernize that. What is the great force of nature in our world today? Sex, my friend. It is sex that drives the headlines, that sells stories, that makes news. Give people a scandal tied to sex, and they'll devour it far more eagerly than any political conspiracy." Poirot leaned forward, his voice dropping to a confidential whisper. "My task was to put my hands in the mud, just as Hercules did, and build a dam to change the course of the river. A journalistic friend of mine helped me. He searched Denmark, found the right woman, and casually mentioned the X-ray news to her. She remembered it, of course." The full realization hit Edward like a thunderbolt. "So, it was all mud, a mess of scandal. And my wife, Dagmar, was at the center of it all? You used her?" His voice was tinged with a mixture of disbelief and fury. But before Poirot could respond, the door swung open, and Mrs. Ferrier entered the room with her usual grace, a calm smile on her face. "Well," she said in her soft voice, "that went off very well." Edward blinked in utter confusion. "Dagmar, did you know about all of this?" Mrs. Ferrier gave him a sweet, serene smile. "Of course, dear, I knew from the start." Edward was stunned. "And you never told me? You never said a word?" "But, Edward, you would never have let Monsieur Poirot do it if you had known," she replied softly, her eyes twinkling with a knowing look. Edward opened his mouth to protest, but Poirot interrupted with a mischievous grin. "Indeed, Edward would never have agreed to it. That is why I had to keep the secret." Mrs. Ferrier smiled at both of them, her voice gentle. "I had a very restful time with the dear bishop. He's such a good man. I feel full of energy now. In fact, I've been invited to christen the new battleship in Liverpool next month. I think it would be a popular thing to do, don't you think?" Edward stared at her, still grappling with the revelation. The woman he had married, the woman he thought he knew, had been part of this entire grand ruse. A tide of emotions flooded him, relief, anger, admiration. But one thing was clear. Nothing in their world would ever be the same again,